100's AI Next 100's campaign around AI and data centers and conservation seeks to bring awareness to an important environmental issue. Current corporate and federal approaches to artificial intelligence innovation risk long-term impacts to our infrastructure and energy development, to local communities, health, public health, and natural resources. Next 100 is engaging with policymakers, NGO partners, and other grassroots organizations to mitigate the negative environmental impacts that comes along with AI innovation. At our first webinar about the overall impact of AI, Dr. Amy Sharma, Executive Director of of Science for Georgia, discussed the significant number of unknowns about data centers, including true estimates of power and water usage. And so today we'll be digging deeper into the conversation for AI, energy impacts, and policy approaches. Over the next hour, you'll hear from our Next 100 staff. You'll also hear from Matt Bolden, Climate Policy Advisor for the Senate Environmental and Public Works Committee, and Emily Odgers, who is the grid specialist with the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. And today we'll be talking about the impacts of energy on conservation, environmental justice, and policy making. I'll hand it over to my colleague, Jonathan Terrell, to get us started. Thanks, Jonathan.
Thanks so much, Karen. Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan Terrell, Program Manager for the Next 100 Coalition. Before we get into our wonderful presentations from our guest speakers, Matt and Emily, today, I want to start with a broad overview of some of the current trends of environmental impacts of AI energy. Today, Matt will talk about Senator Whitehouse's office approach to AI, including the Clean Cloud Act, a bill recently introduced to the Senate by Senator Whitehouse and Senator Fetterman. We'll also hear from Emily to give an overview of state legislation addressing AI energy and the environment. To close our webinar, we'll have some opportunities to discuss and ask our guests some questions and have some crosstalk. Before we get into the policy briefs from Matt and Emily, I want to identify a few basic facts about AI and environment that's informing Next 100's organizing whenever it comes to mitigating the conservation impacts of AI energy. First, artificial intelligence requires a significant amount of energy to maintain its operations. A couple things that we don't know. It's unclear how much energy AI requires. In many cases, companies claim energy use is proprietary information, and so it's difficult to get true estimates of their energy use. However, according to a December 2024 study by the federal government, AI infrastructure is going to use 12% annually of the national energy supply by the year 2028. So it's going to be a significant driver of energy use. It's clear that demand for energy is partially being driven by AI, and both government and private companies are playing a role in driving that demand. For example, in Georgia, utility companies such as Georgia Power are speculating that demand will need to increase for AI data centers. In some cases, the new generation sources being proposed are solar and wind. In others, coal and natural gas are being proposed to power these AI data centers. There seems to be an urgency for data center development, likely driven by claims that the United States is in a race to develop AI models that are better than other countries, and that's creating pressure for rapid energy demand to match, in turn incentivizing cheaper traditional energy generation systems. This is having a significant impact on ratepayers across the country. We'll hear more about from both of our guests about efforts to create protections for ratepayers, but without regulatory safeguards, there is a risk of energy generation required for data centers having the effect of increasing an everyday customer's utility bill. Rather than mandating that companies that are driving increases take on their share of the burden of this new generation, outdated pay structures for utilities may cause a consumer to have an outsized benefit without any direct benefit. As a potential response to shift energy burden away from communities, some companies propose the creation of new generation that is co-located with AI data centers themselves. However, the regulatory landscape is currently significantly varied from state to state, like Emily will talk about, and co-location of carbon-based or nuclear energy generation may negatively impact the environment and public health based on the siting conditions of that energy. For example, if you haven't heard, in Memphis, Tennessee, Elon Musk's xAI data center, nicknamed Colossus, is currently using large biodiesel generators to power the large facility. It's causing significant air pollution concerns due to the nitrous oxide emissions or NOx emissions that those generators are creating. And some claim the company is using a loophole in the Clean Air Act that prevents the data center from requiring clean air permits to operate generators. Without a regulatory landscape that prioritizes community and environmental health and safety, there are concerns that co-location of energy in these areas and private facilities will continue to have negative impacts. Finally, there's a corporate accountability piece here. Some companies claim to maintain energy efficiency and zero carbon emissions goals. However, without significant regulation and incentives, we fear market forces will drive companies to rely on cheap, carbon-intensive energy sources. Recent reports from Microsoft and Google reflect an increase in carbon emissions since those goals were made, rather than a continued decrease in emissions toward the company's long-term net zero and carbon negative goals. So, keeping these 5 principles in mind, I'm eager to hear more from our speakers, Matt Bolden and Emily Augers. First, we'll have Matt, who is a climate policy advisor with the Environment and Public Works Committee, where he covers industrial decarbonization, carbon border adjustments, and market-based climate policies for the committee and its ranking member, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. Prior to this, he was the Chief of Staff and Director of Policy and Government Relations at the Climate Leadership Council, where he worked with a coalition of environmental organizations and companies to advance bipartisan climate policies. He started his career as a financial analyst at an impact investing firm, where he underwrote investments in green tech, real estate, and community development projects. Matt earned his Bachelor's of Arts in Environmental Studies with a minor in Physical Sciences from Yale and US College. Matt, thanks so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Jonathan, and sort of scary to see like I think 8-year-old picture of myself on the screen, so I'm going to try to ignore that. Huge thanks to Next 100 Coalition for having me, and for all of you all for taking the time to spend a little bit of your afternoon on this really important problem. So I think Jonathan and I may have been reading from the same songbook, because a lot of what he just said, I wrote down in my sort of notes and script for myself to say to you all today. But a couple housekeeping things. My name is Matt Bolden, as Jonathan said. I cover for the Environment Public Works Committee the parts of climate policy that either touch economics or some of the harder sectors to decarbonize. So think like planes, steelmaking, maritime shipping, hydrogen, that sort of thing. So I spend a lot of time sort of talking and working with tech people to figure out what are the right incentives we can put in place here in the federal government to get markets created for folks to produce energy, to produce steel, produce other industrial goods more cleaner, more efficiently, in a way that's better for all of us and better for our climate goals. I want to say these views I'm about to espouse are my own. They're not necessarily those of my boss, Senator Whitehouse. But I work very closely with him to sort of figure out this issue and the right way to address it, because it's a tricky issue. I mean, from our perspective, I think we very much agree with a lot of what Jonathan said. We are facing a situation where there is a surge in power demand and a sort of growth in new clean generation, whether we're talking solar or wind, or we're talking big grid scale batteries, that's not keeping up with the pace of that demand. And you're seeing, as a result of that, folks backsliding into coal, folks building more gas. And whether you're looking at this from the national level or the company level, climate targets are commitments to do, our part to reduce emissions, to keep our promises to the next generation, we owe them, and to, clean up our air, generally speaking, that they are sort of at risk as a result of this. I think one other stat to add to what Jonathan said, the International Energy Agency, which is sort of this big data group out of the EU, they forecast that half the electricity demand growth in the United States from now through to 2030 is going to be just data centers. And that's, from my perspective, a tremendous factor impacting what's going to happen, not just for the folks in this country, our progress on climate and cleaning up our air, but also from the company's perspective, how they're going to be able to make the investments they need to transition to sort of a zero carbon future. I mean, here in the Mid-Atlantic, it's the PJM footprint, we're seeing 11 to 19% bill increases. Either, I think, kicking at the end of this month is what some folks are saying. It's a sort of result of some of the market dynamics we're seeing sort of started last summer. And that's going to be hitting like folks' pocketbooks very soon. If you look at Louisiana, they're projecting a 90% increase in rates by 2030. Where I'm from, where I grew up, Oregon, residential rates have gone up 50% in the last 5 years. And like, this is real. Everybody feels this, whether you are a household, whether you are a steel manufacturer, whether you are making EVs. These are real costs that are adding friction to the system, making it harder for folks to afford their day-to-day needs, take care of their kids, take care of their loved ones. And it's coming at this expense of this massive demand for energy from some of the richest companies in the United States and in the world. We also know it's bad for the climate. We know it's bad for the environment. A number of the utilities supplying the power to these companies and a lot of the companies themselves have been channeling this big growth in demand towards fossil fuels as opposed to towards renewables. So we know across New York, there are a number of crypto miners that have co-located with either pulled out of gas power plants that are pulled out of retirement or new gas power plants that are providing dedicated electricity just to mine crypto. We know revenues from crypto mining are also being used to essentially prop up fossil fuel industries in sort of legacy fossil fuel states across the country. There are stories out of Pennsylvania where the largest coal-fired power plant, sort of this old legacy power plant, which is retired, is now being turned into a gas-powered data center campus with 4.5 gigawatts of dedicated gas-fired power, making it the third largest power plant in the country just for data centers. If you look at Nebraska, there were plans to close a 1950s era coal plant, which is old. I mean, it's really kind of the worst of your power generation, which were put on hold because there's so much power demand coming from these data centers. Similar stories in Appalachia, sort of across the country. And, as I said, we know this is affecting not just sort of average everyday consumers, but also other companies, whether if you're looking to decarbonize your footprint, whether you are somebody buying you have an internal combustion engine car, and you want to buy a hybrid, you want to buy an EV, whether you're building an electric arc furnace to make steel, whether you're looking to do clean chemistry, green chemistry, you're going to be relying on the grid more. That's electrification. We know that some of the power demand surge we're seeing isn't just from these data centers, it's from a broader effort or sort of countrywide effort to move away from fossil fuels. And if there aren't clean electrons available to supply those energy needs, we're not going to successfully be able to move away from fossil fuels. And I think equally as important, we're not going to remain economically competitive as we sort of move into this next century. So I think the question that, as we looked at this problem, is what do we do? This is, as Jonathan mentioned, grids are very complicated. I think, if you look at sort of the different grid regions across the country, everybody kind of governs these issues very differently. It gets really wonky. And there's sort of, this is very much an example where the federal government can kind of set broad incentives at the top level, but historically, a lot of the policymaking here has either been worked out on the state level or sometimes really in sort of really backroom deals between the individual companies and the utilities themselves. So earlier this year, Senators Whitehouse and Fetterman introduced the Clean Cloud Act. And what that bill does is it creates what I would call an emissions performance standard for crypto miners and data centers. It sends a economy-wide signal that if you have to pick between new clean electrons or going to coal, going to gas, you have every reason now to make the right choice and build new clean electricity. The bill ensures that all facilities are actually doing a proper accounting for the emissions that they're responsible for. So if you look now, I mean, there's no, the way we traditionally account for how clean your electricity is, what the emissions are associated with it. You can buy basically a coupon to say that this clean electricity is my clean electricity on this sort of nationwide market. but there's no way to necessarily certify that that clean electricity is actually being delivered to your site, to your facility. We don't know that that clean electricity wasn't claimed from somebody else and you just bought it off them. And we don't know that that clean electricity is actually being generated in the hours you are requiring energy during the day. And all of those things have implications for consumer bills, the amount of electricity actually available on the grid, and carbon emissions. So this bill requires you to basically comply with something that's, forgive the technical jargon, something called the three pillars. It's these sort of three rules called of incrementality, time matching, and deliverability. Basically ensuring that you're not cannibalizing existing clean generation, you're adding to the total pool of clean energy, you are actually generating the energy when you're using it, so on an hour by hour basis, and the power is actually physically reaching you. You're not claiming, you're not in Alaska running a data center and claiming electrons from wind turbines out in Kansas. Under the Clean Cloud Act, if you are not decarbonizing on track with a carbon-free by 2035 goal, then your facilities have to pay a penalty for excess emissions. The revenues from this penalty then get reinvested in helping residential consumers offset the costs of these data centers and these surging power demands on their power bills, and also investing in getting on the grid new clean generation or long duration storage that can meet the 24/7 power needs of these data centers. So it's addressing kind of both of the big problems that are being caused by this kind of rush towards either old or new fossil fuels. Now, we know some of the big investors in data centers are, I mean, to their credit, making efforts to do the right thing here. They're either investing in nascent clean energy technologies, either in the companies themselves or individual projects. Some of them have gone into really complicated, wonky agreements with their utilities to ensure that they bear the full cost of 24/7 clean power that can actually meet the needs of the facilities. But we know that's not true across the board. So the way we see this bill essentially says, you know, a lot of you have committed to, I mean, really 2030 carbon-free targets, these big public commitments. You made a lot of big press releases about it. We're going to ensure that you have every reason to keep your word and that your competitors are going to follow your lead. From the center's perspective, the bottom line is you don't have to pick between leading on AI and leading on climate and the environment and doing the right thing by your neighbors. This bill would ensure that, you know, we are all essentially acting here as good corporate stewards as we work to develop the economy of the future and decarbonize our grid. So thanks again to Next 100 for having me. Look forward to your questions. It's a wonky topic, so I tried to keep it high level, but happy to sort of dig into the nuts and bolts as much as folks are interested. So I'm looking forward to your questions.
Matt, thanks so much. Before we do question and answer, I'm going to hand it over to Emily. I'll share the slide and then she'll cue things up. I'm going to go ahead and stop there so that way you get ready there, Emily. Introduce our next speaker. Emily Odgers joins us as the grid specialist from the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. Emily's passion for environmental policy began at age 12 whenever she joined a local campaign to prevent a landfill expansion in her neighborhood. This early experience sparked a lifelong commitment to building a cleaner, more just, and more sustainable world. More recently, Emily worked on grid policy and regulatory issues in Texas at Stoic Energy Consulting. Before her work in Texas, she served as a staffer in the Massachusetts state legislature, where she played a key role in successfully passing legislation to implement a statewide net zero building code. She holds a bachelor's degree in sociology and anthropology from Warren Wilson College, where she was also a Bonner Scholar and AmeriCorps member. Emily, welcome. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. Really appreciate getting to listen to you and Matt. So as Jonathan said, I'm Emily. I work with the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. And if you're not familiar with us, NCEL, we are a nationwide network of over 1,000 legislators from all 50 states and both parties. And our role at NCEL is really to serve as the resources and remote environmental staff for state legislators. State legislators, if you're not familiar, are oftentimes very under-resourced, they're underpaid, and we really, our goal is to try to step in and help fill those gaps. And we do that with a couple different of our program areas. So as the grid specialist, I work with climate and energy, but we also have programs in conservation, environmental health, and oceans, which is very helpful in a topic like this, data centers, which really impacts all of these realms, whether it comes to land use, energy, and the air that we breathe. And as I said, we really are rooted in our legislators and this what we hear from state lawmakers across the country. And so I wanted to share this quote from one of our members, Assemblyman Dave Bailey, who ended up filing legislation, a couple of bills on data centers. For us, it's so important to be responsive to what state lawmakers are seeing and needing and hearing from their constituents. And from the first state capital visit we had this year in January in Virginia, we were hearing about data centers nonstop, and it hasn't ceased then. This is what lawmakers who are really, no offense to Congress, the sort of that front line with people, they're interacting with folks on such that local level. This is what they're hearing from people. And so that has led us to respond by doing our sort of bread and butter work of research, sharing best practices, and tracking policy across states. So this, with our state tracking on legislation related to implementing protections, guardrails, addressing various issues of data centers, these are the states that we've seen having legislation filed this past legislative session. And then I'm going to get into a couple of the different trends that we've been seeing in these bills because they really run the gamut. There have been over 70 bills filed, and the themes that we've seen emerge are around transparency, ratepayer protection, demand-side solutions, clean energy requirements, and land use and zoning restrictions. One thing that's really important, and I think is a really great thing about this conversation, is that this is really not a partisan issue on the state level. We're seeing both Democrats and Republicans be concerned and want to make sure that this new type of industry is we're maximizing the benefits and limiting any of the negatives. Okay. So that first policy trend, transparency, what we're really seeing in a lot of states is that state legislators and grid operators, public utility commissions, they just have no idea. They have no sense of the amount of energy and water that is being used by these facilities. And so a lot of states have introduced legislation requiring data centers to just regularly report how much energy and water they are using for their facilities. And so here listed here are a couple of states that have done that. Just note that all of these bills listed here are just meant for examples. They're not an exhaustive list of what we're seeing. And then tied to that, another method that legislatures are addressing the transparency issue is around just larger studies. So Maryland passed this legislative session the creation of a commission to study the environmental and energy impacts of data centers. Georgia passed that in their 2023 session, similarly was vetoed by their governor. So this need to just better understand what's happening. For a lot of state lawmakers, this feels like a good first step and a way to not necessarily that is generally still friendly towards the industry and is saying, hey, we don't want you to not come to our state. We just want to understand what the impacts are. The other really major thing, as that quote from Assemblyman Bailey noted, is the impacts on ratepayers and affordability is such a huge concern. It is probably the number one thing we hear from state legislators is this concern around affordability and energy bills going up and bills for everything else going up. So states have begun to tackle this as well. Georgia's bill is kind of a very common model that we're seeing around prohibiting any types of costs that are related to new grid infrastructure from being passed down to ratepayers if the cost is only the infrastructure is really just serving the data center. So we've seen similar bills in Virginia, New Jersey, Oregon. A lot of it is this idea of we need to create a separate separate category, a separate tariff specifically for data centers, because they are just, our system that we have right now is just like not set up to really consider them and ensure that those costs are not being passed down. We're also seeing some more, a bit different and innovative solutions coming out of states like Utah and Texas that are really about trying to change, not necessarily go through the regulatory way, but to say, what if we can just make it easier for data centers to contract directly with generators, but in a way that is still regulated? So that's been the Utah approach. I'll also talk about Texas later and how they are going about that. Demand side solutions. So looking at things like industrial demand response programs, energy efficiency. This is not something we've seen as many bills about, but we know is a really important area. For any researchers on this call, I will do a call out to say, I think this is an area that is currently under-researched, and we could use a lot more information on how effective and capable these types of programs are. But we are seeing states like New Jersey and Virginia and move forward on thinking about how can these large loads be assets to the grid? How can they be flexible? When can they turn off in a way to make sure that prices are not skyrocketing and other people like residencies, small businesses, community centers aren't losing power during things like the heat wave that is currently going on in the Northeast. Energy requirements is another thing we're not seeing quite as much as, but in states, particularly states that have clean energy goals and emission reduction goals, we are seeing this concern and that the energy data centers will use will be largely gas or other emitting resources. And so states like New Jersey, New York, Oregon, they've introduced legislation to ensure that data centers, at least by a certain date, procure all or most of their energy from renewable sources. And then lastly, one of the trends that we're seeing is around land use and zoning. So data centers, the big things that usually get talked about are energy and water. But when you talk to local people, especially people who have data centers near them, a lot of the things that come up are also things like noise, or is this impacting conservation land? Or is this creating air pollution, especially if they have backup diesel generators? Is this something that is making the air more toxic to breathe for my kids? And so we're also seeing states go about looking at ways to restrict where data centers can be zoned, the type of land they can be sited on, and making sure that municipalities have all the information before they go into these agreements and create permits with these centers to make sure that it's not having a net negative impact on the community. So I really wanted to highlight 2 states that have enacted legislation this session. One is Texas, and Texas passed this bill, SB 6, that does a lot of things. I tried to cover as many of them here as possible. But one of the things that they have required is more transparency and disclosures from data centers. So Texas is really getting a lot of data centers wanting to interconnect to their system. They have put in a flat $100,000 fee for interconnection studies to help deal with that cost, and also requiring large load users to pay for any additional studies needed. They've required data centers and other large loads to disclose if they're trying to do an interconnection in other states or parts of Texas, because if you're familiar with this, there's this big issue called venue shopping and phantom load, where basically data centers are going to like 8 different states, the companies that are trying to build them, 8 different states to build the same data center, the one individual data center, but they're asking 8 different states to figure out where the best deal is. And so potentially we are overestimating actually how much of these data centers are going to be built, and therefore over planning and over investing in certain grid infrastructure, whether that's generation or otherwise. So there's really interesting things going on in Texas around data centers. The other piece I wanted to highlight is just Oregon, which is some of this ratepayer protection stuff we were talking about earlier, creating a new customer class for the large loads. and requiring them to sign a 10-year contract to pay a minimum amount for their energy and any new transmission infrastructure. So again, just really trying to address that affordability impact. And I highlighted these two states because I think anybody could know, if you're from the US, that Oregon and Texas are two very, very different states, very different political makeups. And I just really want to underscore as my one of my final takeaways that this is not a conversation that's happening on partisan lines, and that I think it's important for all of us to continue trying to make sure it stays that way, and that recognize that this is a topic that just is impacting people, no matter what the letter is next to their name. And we can, on the state level at least, work to address it in that way. Some other things, just emphasizing again, affordability is like the number one big issue we're hearing from people. It's just people don't want their energy bills to be any higher than they already are. This is the early stage of policymaking on the state level. The amount of bills filed this session was much higher than any other time before. So we're going to see more innovations. We're going to see what doesn't work in other states. And hopefully, and for us at NCEL, our goal is to help states learn from that and say, hey, this is what they did in Virginia. This is what worked. This is what didn't work. How can we move from there? And then finally, really, again, the focus is just mitigating the negative impacts. It's not saying we can't have this industry here, we shouldn't have this industry here. A lot of these state lawmakers really care about the economy as well and promoting revenue for their municipalities. The views on data centers and AI really run the gamut when I talk to legislators who are working on bills like this. So just to like really emphasize, this is not like an anti-growth, wanting economic development type of issue. So that's it for me. Happy to answer any questions and appreciate your time.
Emily, thank you so much. Emily, Matt, thank you both so much for giving your time and expertise today. I'm already seeing a number of questions in the chat, but before we give it over, I do just want to take a moment and ask a question of both of you, which is, as someone who is working on federal policy primarily and as someone who is working on state policy primarily, on this issue, what are some things that you would like to communicate kind of up or down for, a state kind of policy takeaway that could be a model for federal policy making, Emily, or Matt, if there's specific need or model that the federal government is seeking that legislators and policymakers are looking for. Is there anything here to really kind of to have some crosstalk on, I guess, is the big kind of meta question.
I mean, I'll just say quickly, I think a couple things that I think really Emily reflected well in what she said. I think this issue is starting to bubble up to the federal level. I think, not to be too denigrating to my sort of part of the system, we tend to move slower, I think, than state houses. I think that the more folks can talk to their representatives, talk to their senators, talk to elected officials that, hey, this is a thing we're concerned about. This is a thing we're starting to see on our power bills. I think that's important. I think, we are, as Emily said, really much in the very much in the awareness building, education building phase of this. I think it's also important to, I think recognize that this is going to be, unfortunately, not, and I always hate being the person that says this, one of those weird issues where it's going to require a kind of a patchwork approach. It's some states are going to do one thing, other states are going to do another thing. The federal government, maybe in an ideal world, we would hope, would do some sort of wraparound incentive approach to sort of help with transparency, help with sort of creating the right economic incentives and building in the guardrails that folks don't get taken advantage of here. But it is very much a anytime you talk about the grid or things that touch the grid, I mean, at least personally, my head starts to spin you do sort of have to figure out like how do you plug these different holes and kind of build your little Jenga tower out of a mix of different pillars.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think, like Matt said, the states often are the incubators of policy when it comes to new and emerging issues. And so my hope is as we are seeing more of these bills in the implementation phase, that we can just keep open lines of communication on what is working and what isn't working. And if there are there's certainly issues that need to be dealt with on the federal level with FERC, and just to make sure that those things are being communicated and carried over. And I would say that, the other branch of or portion of government that we don't have represented here is local government, municipal government, and they are also really important in this discussion. And I know that a lot of the state legislators I work with, they are always trying to bring more education and information to their local leaders around data centers. But it can be really hard. Like these are really massive, wealthy companies, and the people who work on the local level, they don't have it. They have sometimes even less resources than they do on the state level. So making sure that we're just shoring people up and helping build that knowledge and ensuring people know all the possible outcomes.
Thanks, Emily and Matt. Yeah, that's, I think, really helpful to hear, and also really helpful to set some organizing targets and approaches for an organization like X100 Coalition that has the opportunity to work at the local, state, and federal level on this issue. We've got 20 minutes left in the call. I want to give as much time as possible to answer audience questions. I'm going to go ahead and start paraphrasing some of the questions that we've received in the chat. If you added multiple questions in your comments, thanks. We will do our best to get to each of them. Just to give everyone as much time as possible, I'm going to kind of ask everyone's first question and then move to the next. If you have a question, also feel free to put your hand up and we can go from there. But I'll start with Joe Thibault's question, asking, why can't we, as in the federal government, simply tax crypto miners the actual cost of their electricity and return those funds to the local utility, like a carbon tax? There's a little bit more commentary and context to that question, but Matt, Emily, curious for any gut responses there.
I'll just say right off the bat, Senator Whitehouse is a longtime proponent of putting a price on carbon and making sure that the externality around pollution are adequately accounted for in the price of a product. It's one of the things I've spent, the past, however long I've been in DC at this point working on. So, certainly supportive of carbon taxes. I think that at least on the federal level, if anything these days, the prevailing winds are in the direction of reducing taxes, much to our chagrin, for sort of big corporate interests and sort of the wealthiest Americans in our society. So I think we could. I think it would certainly not be a bad policy, depending, a lot of the devil's in the detail here. So as I mentioned, how are you accounting for electricity? Is it your grid average mix? Are you trying to do some sort of marginal emissions accounting where, if everyone sort of has their load met, but you put on a giant 1 gigawatt data center onto the grid, and now they have to turn on like a coal plant that they've had in the back that hasn't been running for the past 10 years. What is your emissions, like what emissions are allocated to you? It turns out that's actually not a straightforward question, particularly, if you do the flip side, what if you co-locate in front of like an existing solar field and that's now directly serving your data center? Should you be getting credit for that solar field? Well, it depends, I think, is sort of the honest answer there. And so a lot of the devil lives in the details here because we are dealing with the painful wonkiness of the grid, and we get these weird acronyms like FERC and NERC and the NRC, and it's just sort of a bad time unless you really want to dig into this stuff. But I think it's certainly, it's certainly an approach that we would be supportive of. I think one thing we were trying to do with the Clean Cloud Act and this piece of legislation in particular is try to sort of, I mean, this is, I think, as Emily said, a very much a cross-cutting issue politically. And, I think that we were trying to put out a piece of legislation that united a lot of different interests. It has the support of the utility workers union. It has the support of some environmental groups. It has the support of sort of more like the grid wonks as well. And I think our interest here was building sort of a different cross-sectional coalition to elevate this issue and elevate an approach that we think is fair and just.
Yeah. Emily, anything to add there?
Yeah, I'll just add, I think there are ways that states are going about it slightly similar or differently, but in the same vein in terms of like what we're seeing in Texas around, this minimum payment for interconnection studies, what we're seeing in Oregon around this like 10-year contract and like having to pay in their bill, there's like basically a minimum of what the data centers have to pay for their energy. And if they go over what with their energy usage of that minimum, they have to pay the difference. So I think states are really trying to find ways, mostly through like the tariff process, to ensure that data centers are paying for what they're using.
Thanks. So the other thing that I'll say, I think your question also reflects really sorting out, where some of these data centers are different from the others, especially in use cases. Just because you mentioned crypto mining in your question, I do want to direct and connect you with one of the expert advocates against crypto mining and sort of irresponsible crypto mining development. On this call, Cindy Robertson, who has a question farther down below, would love to connect the two of you if crypto mining are issues that you have in common. I'm going to keep us moving to Krista's question. There's a couple of quick hits here. One of the big questions that she was asking, do we have more recent studies with states like New Mexico and Arizona are in arid lands and have been in the past 5 years and now have data centers? It seems like Krista's questions are also more about water and energy uses, especially in the Southwest. Emily, anything out of NCEL's research and legislative engagement in Southwestern policymaking and environmental issues?
I've not heard as much about that. I think the state in the Southwest that's been really focusing on data centers the most is Texas. I don't believe they have as much studies going on, at least through the state legislature, around water impacts. There was a provision in their data center bill that was around enabling water utilities, I believe, to have their own generation systems as backup generators. So there is a recognition that this is an issue, but so far there hasn't been, as far as I know, study specifically on the Southwest.
I mean, I'll just say quickly, I think, as Emily said, well, the data issue here is a significant one. I think there's been a little bit more studying of the sort of the power demand pieces of that. Where is there a large concentration of power demand that's stemming solely from data centers? I think like a number of the national labs are doing really interesting work trying to track that out. Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, one of them. I think NREL did a thing recently. I think that is certainly, I think, an important step in like starting the right direction. Where this gets tricky is, I think it's important also to disambiguate between where there are currently data centers and where there are companies bidding for slots in their connection queue and sort of saying that they're going to do a lot of data center development in a particular space, because those are different. And part of the problem here is that if you're a utility, whether you're a utility that's trying to decarbonize or a utility that doesn't care about that at all, we wish you did. the question you're facing is, what do I have to do today to catch the power demand I'm going to be dealing with in 5, 10 years? And just given the nature of the way this economy is working right now in the energy generation space, things are not moving very quickly. And so there's a lot of slow moving pieces and a lot of efforts to try to predict and try to mitigate risks around how big of a growth we're going to have here. And the more, there's, I think, a lot of good that can be done just in like untangling that and getting some more clarity and transparency around that. And I mean, insofar as that sort of can trend towards, I think, information water use as well. I mean, it's, I'll just say anecdotally from my conversations with folks, even in like the tech industry, they would like to know more about water use as well. It is at least on the federal level, not as well studied as I think people might think. We don't have generally great data on the quality and sort of health of various reservoirs in this country. Uh, so it's a very important issue. I think in a number of ways, it's an emerging one that's going to be more and more important in the years to come.
Matt, the last thing that I'll say to this question, to Krista, especially your question 4, how can existing speakers or Next 100 lead on this, and then share this data to dig deeper, especially whenever it comes to some of the data centers that we're seeing. I'm based here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and monitoring things over to our western border in Arizona, especially the greater Phoenix and Mesa area, where there's a large number of data centers being developed. Definitely something that we're looking at in terms of state legislative engagement and making sure that water is not being used recklessly at the expense of this AI innovation. Really excited to connect with you more on this issue and other folks in the Southwest in general. I'm going to keep us moving and go to Kyle's question. Kyle, thanks for asking this because it's one that I had as well. Emily, do you see the current language in the reconciliation package pertaining to AI regulation impacting these bills you mentioned?
Yeah, would also love to get Matt's thoughts on this. I would say, if you're familiar with it, for us, like we've been communicating with a couple different of our partner organizations on this, and the sort of long and short of it is that there's concerns over how vague that language is, but there's not necessarily strong concerns that this will impede these bills because it's, if I recall correctly, a little more focused on other aspects of AI and not the actual physical construction of data centers. Which is not to say that those other aspects of what they're disallowing state regulation on AI would be a good thing to pass. But generally speaking, it's just like kind of a general concern about the vagueness of the language, wanting more clarification, but at this point, not seeing it as a direct threat to state action.
I'll be honest, I have not seen the latest version of that language. It got recently amended. My sense is that this is something I mean, it is pretty vague language. I mean, it's the reconciliation context, which for a number of reasons makes the language more vague than it typically is in sort of more regular order legislation on the federal level. So, this is something that can, I think, very much be litigated, is my sense, given that there is so much of it's not obvious where this would apply, where this would not apply. It also uses things like that is reasonably cost-based, and that's not actually like we're not given a ruler to determine what that is here. That's not something I keep on my desk. So it is an open question. I think there are certainly arguments to be made either way for how that would apply or how that would not apply to a number of these things. I think probably for things that are like studies and stuff, I can't imagine this would affect it. But if you're doing, for example, like a very, very just throw spaghetti into the wall. If you're like to do a state level carbon tax on just like AI data centers, there's that could very well be impeded by something like this. Is just my read of language, but that's leave that to the lawyers.
Thanks both. This is also an issue that Next 100 has been tracking, and we have expressed similar concerns, including to Matt and other federal legislators, about the vagueness of the language. It's a thing that I think we're nervous about. Ironically, federal overreach in the current situation of government. Especially whenever it comes to common sense legislation that's already been enacted, including some of the bills that Emily discussed. I think it's really interesting to see it pass through the parliamentarians' reading, and we'll continue to track it. If other folks on this call are tracking the moratorium language in the bill, please feel free to connect. I'm going to keep us moving with Jimena's question. She had a couple. She specifically said, her first question, I know virtual power plants are still fairly new, and I have been reading/hearing about VPPs, how they can help mitigate stress on the grid as energy demand surges. Do you think this technology is promising as data centers increase demand, and how feasible is it for consumers?
Yeah, I mean, we love virtual power plants at NCEL, and we've definitely seen a lot of, or a growing number of legislatures advance bills that would help promote or remove the barriers to virtual power plants. I don't know if the question is specifically about virtual power plants for data centers. I think that this is where the demand flexibility conversation comes in a bit, and are there ways to make sure that we can use data centers, if they're going to exist, as grid assets to ramp up and ramp down when needed. But generally supportive of virtual power plants. And Texas has a really great program that I would point to, and I can drop a link in the chat, or maybe one of my colleagues can, to our resource on state legislation related to virtual power plants and similar concept of microgrids.
Yeah, I'll just add quickly, and I think Emily largely said this. As far as I've seen, there's not really been, I think, a lot of work being done to develop either AI models or systems or sort of network systems that can, on the data center side, do that demand response. So they can't like power down when there needs to be more energy available on the grid, or there's like a heat wave, so there's a big demand spike. That could be a thing. I think that certainly would be something with the center's bill would incentivize. I think it's it's an open question on the sort of the operator side whether that's like actually going to be viable from how they're designing these things, or whether or not they're just going to like whether it makes more economic sense just to do more to secure and build out more clean generation to meet all our needs. It could go either way.
One last question, and then we'll wrap things up. For Matt from Cindy Robertson, what are the next steps for passage of the Clean Cloud Act, and how can we help?
Well, great to hear from you, Cindy. I'd say, I'd echo what I said earlier on this call, which is I think on the federal level, this is very much an issue that folks are starting to wrap their heads around. Now I think this is going to touch on some of the questions that I see in the chat for later, came later. When I look at my job as a staffer here, a lot of what I try to do is I try to sort of figure out where are folks' interests, where are sort of the political fissures, where can we sort of build coalitions that can align folks around basic concepts and premises to get to passing a bill. I think folks have very different interests in this issue. And this is sort of why when I sort of laid this all out when I spoke for the 10 minutes, this particular problem impacts lots of sort of goals that folks have, whether you're like my boss, really care about reducing carbon emissions and meeting our climate and environmental targets, and doing right by next generations. That's certainly a piece of this, but it's also like there are broader, like if you care about, I want to make steel in this country, this also impedes that. So I think that finding ways to talk about this, to raise the profile of how it affects a lot of different interests, I think is very important. And that's just sort of where we are right now. Unfortunately, this is going to, I mean, if I were to be predictive, I think this is going to be an issue that we're going to have to work through quite a bit as the federal government to like get our heads around to go and do thoughtful legislation on this. It's going to take time. It's not going to happen this Congress. And so the more folks like you all can try to build awareness and argue for why this is an important thing to address, the more folks like me are able to push for more ambitious policy. But it's democracy. We respond to the voters, and we gotta respect that.
Matt, Emily, thank you both so much for your words and presentation today. Everyone give Matt and Emily a nice virtual round of applause. Thank you both so much for your time. At X100, the Conservation, AI, and Data Centers campaign continues to be an important priority. We're currently seeking to secure funding and partners to enhance this portfolio and continue doing good education, relationship building, and coalition building around the energy aspect of this issue and more. We'll be having a water-focused webinar early this fall, late this summer. If folks on this call know of individuals working at the intersection of water and data center policy, please give me a ring. We'll have a recording of this webinar available to folks who registered in the days to come. And to end today, we just want to thank you for taking the time out of the busyness that everyone has going on. Thanks for paying attention to this issue and letting us take some of your time to educate you more about it. I hope that this webinar was helpful to you. It was certainly a great brainstorming and enlightening moment for me. If you have more questions or just comments, please feel free to reach out to the email in the slide or send me a DM in the chat as we close out. But with that, just want to say thank you one more time to both of our guests and everyone who attended today. Really, really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Krista.
I'm Meli.